My name is Wayne Johnson. I'm a veterinarian living in Beijing. I have been in China for 16 of the past 25 years. Welcome to the first edition of Oinkpod. The purpose of Oinkpod is to provide new information and technical information for the pig industry. I hope that you will find it useful to you. As you look at Oinkpod right now, you see a blank slate, what we call a tabula rasa. And we have no purpose other than to provide help to the pig industry. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. Well, we have an expression in English, when are you going to do something? When are you going to wear this nice orange pair of pants? And the people will answer, oh, when pigs fly. When pigs fly, it means that we have no real intention to do something. Interesting things happen in the world, and it's time to talk about them. The famous American architect Frank Lloyd Wright died in 1959 at the age of 92. Left a lot of very modern-looking buildings behind him. Some of his buildings, if you look at them today, still look like they would be built sometime in the future. Some of the buildings that Frank Lloyd Wright built in the 1930s look like that they might be built in some future time. They look even very futuristic to us today. In the 1930s, Wright summarized some of his ideas in what he called his organic commandments. By organic, he means that things should operate together like the organs in the body, that the leg bone's connected to the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone's connected to the hip bone, that everything is working together is his meaning of organic. Like the way that the organs in a body work together. It's a kind of systems thinking. Lewis Carroll was a great systems thinker, and so was Frank Lloyd Wright, a genuine systems thinker. We need to think about pork production as being a system and how everything works together. Wright's organic commandments are based upon the concept of virtue. I don't think we have to argue about the value of virtue. That virtue is good unto itself. And he talks about different kinds of virtue. He says that love is the virtue of the heart, and he illustrates that with a circle. That the circle is all surrounding, all encompassing. It doesn't seem to have a beginning or an end to it. The circle doesn't have any sharp edges, although it's certainly crisp. The virtue of the mind is to be sincere. Sincerity is represented by a square, that it is upright and perpendicular. It is told of Wright that he was testifying in court under oath, and when asked a certain question, he testified that he was the world's greatest architect. Someone later asked him, why did you say something like that? Wasn't that rather proud? And he answered, he said, I was under oath. I had to tell the truth. The virtuous working of the mind is to tell the truth and to be honest in what we're doing. Sincerity. The virtue of the spirit is courage. Courage is illustrated by a triangle. The triangle is strong. It is a strong structure. Be courageous and be strong in what we do. To proceed with courage requires some strength, and the virtue of the spirit that lies within man, is to be courageous. The virtue of the will, the desire of the person. Persons a person's will. The virtue of one's will is to be decisive. Wright illustrates this by some pieces laid together to form a structure. Finally, we act to decide to do something, to make a positive decision to do something. Hey, here you have it in English. So we have some Q&A for you today. We have received some questions from the field. And the first question here is in regard to testing for classical swine fever. What is the approximate accuracy of the swine fever antigen test card? The accuracy of any diagnostic test is expressed in terms of its sensitivity and specificity. Sensitivity and specificity are defined in relationship to a gold standard. In the case of classical swine fever, the gold standard is virus isolation. We consider virus isolation to be 100% sensitive. It means that it finds the virus if it's there. We also consider it to be 100% specific. Specificity of a test is its ability to not return false positives, that it says that the virus is there whenever actually it is not. That would be a false positive, and so the rejection of false positives is the specificity of a test. The closest thing to that gold standard is the PCR test. Now, the nucleic acid tests are a little bit different from the virus isolation test because the virus isolation will only detect live virus, whereas the PCR tests will detect dead viruses as well as live ones. We can develop a standard via virus isolation and then use that to assess the sensitivity and specificity of PCR. Now, the antigen test card typically is what we call a antigen capture ELISA test, and it looks for the antigen itself using an antibody reaction that picks up the virus itself. The sensitivity of an antigen capture card is lower than the sensitivity of PCR. The PCR is typically able to detect between 10 and 100 virus particles, and that's actually very sensitive. The antigen capture cards are generally less sensitive than that, although they could be pretty good. The specificity of these tests is generally pretty good. So if you get a positive on the antigen capture test, it probably is a reliable positive. You could say, yes, it really is positive. If it's a positive, it's a true positive. On the other hand, if it comes up negative, these tests don't have great sensitivity, at least not the equivalent sensitivity of a PCR test. The specificity of an antigen capture card has the same problem that we have with PCR, in that if you have the bovine virus diarrhea virus present or the atypical porcine pestivirus is present, it may return a positive result for either one of those and tell you that classical swine fever was present whenever actually it was one of those other two viruses that you're detecting. PCR will detect the BVD virus and may detect the APPV virus, the atypical porcine pestivirus, may detect it as well. But with PCR, you have the opportunity to do virus sequencing, which could tell you which one of those viruses that you have, and also can provide some additional information in regarding the genetic characteristics of the virus, which may be quite useful. A more fundamental problem when testing for classical swine fever is the selection of the sample. That tonsil is a very good sample, and a quite good sample is the buffy coat, the white cells of the blood. The serum is not a particularly good sample for classical swine fever because the serum could be negative, that the white cells readily scavenge up the virus from the blood, and it will be inside those white cells, inside the lymphocytes more specifically. And if you test the serum by PCR or with an antigen capture test, you're quite likely to miss the virus, whereas if you test the white cells specifically, they could be red hot while the serum is actually negative. We've encountered this many times with classical swine fever. Another issue is that the vaccine virus may be detected, that after vaccination with a modified live virus vaccine, the pig will be positive for classical swine fever in the white cells, or perhaps even in the serum, for up to about 17 days. And so we generally would recommend waiting about 30 days after vaccination to test for the classical swine fever virus, because you don't want to pick up unless you're looking for the vaccine virus, you wouldn't want to pick it up, because what you're trying to find with your test for classical swine fever is the persistent infected gilt and persistent infected boars. You want to find those persistent infected animals, which are very troublesome, and is the way that the classical swine fever virus continues to make its living. Even though the animals are vaccinated, they can be persistently infected with the virus and shed the virus and produce a large number of very poor quality pigs that are infected with the virus and spread the virus everywhere, particularly in operations where a great deal of cross-fostering is done. The antigen capture tests are less sensitive than PCR. They could be practical in some situations. Serum is not a good sample, and if you really are wanting to find the virus, you need to draw the blood into an EDTA tube and then take the buffy coat off the sample. Certainly, one of the issues with PCR is the cost of PCR and the issue of having to get it to a laboratory or have the facility to run the PCR for CSF. In my opinion, it is difficult enough to find the persistent infected animal. Generally, I'm recommending a PCR. You can do pooled PCRs, then break down from that. The contamination of the vaccines with the BVD virus can be very, very troublesome. One of the advantages of using the subunit vaccine is that with the E2 subunit vaccine, the concern about BVD contamination and detecting BVD on the test is eliminated. Also, with the E2 subunit vaccine, not only does it produce a more reliable immunity, but it also gives you the opportunity to test for the eRNS or E0 gene. The eRNS means the RNase, the enzyme that destroys RNA. This enzyme protein is not present in the subunit vaccine, and so you can look for the antibody to that. And if the animals indeed have the antibody to eRNS, or also called E0, then you can eliminate them as being infected. Of course, it doesn't tell you whether or not they're persistent infected, for which you would need to do typically a PCR, because it's very sensitive and likely to pick it up. Our second question for today is regard to ASF and ASF vaccination. the development of ASF and vaccine virus in China in the future, its impact on pig farms, and whether ASF vaccine virus will be produced in the future. And the second part is when will the African swine fever vaccine be available? And can we vaccinate and keep producing in the future? The African swine fever virus is a real menace, and we cannot actually live with this virus in the long term, although the eradication of this virus is a huge problem and a huge undertaking to get rid of it, particularly in the way that things operate in China. But nevertheless, we cannot live with this virus in the long term, and we need to consider how we will get rid of it and what steps need to be taken. In the interim, vaccination may offer a kind of what we call a crutch. It's a way of getting around while we can't walk normally. We might need to use a cane or a crutch or of some sort, but to lay that cane aside is certainly very desirable. So far, we don't have any truly useful and safe vaccines for ASF available in the field for general use anywhere in the world. There are a lot of vaccine candidates. Most of them are still considered to be untested. Some of those vaccine viruses, as you're aware, have been introduced out into the field before they were ready to go, and some of them are quite unsafe and have caused some real problems for the pig industry in China. When will the African swine fever vaccine be available? Well, there are at least safe candidates that are in the process of being evaluated, and they're not going to be released until the evaluation is fully complete. And some of those do have some utility in stopping the virus. Some of them have decent safety, and some of them have decent utility. If we consider the situation with pseudorabies and with classical swine fever, we would realize that the vaccine itself is not going to provide 100% sterile immunity. It's not going to create a magic bubble around the pig that's going to stop this virus. I think that we could expect that it would slow it down somewhat, and rather than do a total eradication of a herd, we may be able to go in and vaccinate. I would agree that we could use the vaccine to go into a infected herd and vaccinate for a period of time rather than just simply sending the animals off to slaughter at light weights or digging a big hole and burying them or destroying them in some other way. See, vaccination may be an alternative to destruction in a depopulation situation, but for the long term, we cannot live with this virus, and we must find some way to get it stopped and to get rid of it. The third question is, how valuable is the bathing and cleaning of pregnant sows before entering the farrowing room? Is it necessary? I consider it to be a useful thing to do. How valuable is it? The herds that do this generally have better productivity than the herds that do not. One of the original purposes of bathing the sow was to remove worm eggs, that the sows would be outside and be in the mud, and there would be embryonated worm eggs that would attack the pigs immediately after birth. And in our modern production systems, that is not so much of a problem, but it is still useful, I believe, to bathe the sow. In the pig herd, some pigs are infected with chow fei. Oh, we already have a pet name for African swine fever. Well, I guarantee you it's no friend of mine. But the tooth extraction is not successful. What is the final mortality rate, and what measures can reduce the mortality rate? This is one of the reasons that I don't believe that we can live with this disease. The tooth extraction method is a last resort. Whenever there's nothing else to do, we we can pull them out before they die. What is the fatal mortality rate? No one knows for sure. It could be as low as 70%. It could be as high as 95, almost 100% eventually. And what measures can reduce the mortality rate? We don't have any clear way to stop this thing. There isn't any magic bullet available for stopping the ASF virus, and again is one of the reasons that I don't believe that we can actually live with this monster. It's like taking a rattlesnake to bed with us. We can't quite get along with it. Question number 5 is very interesting. How to become a qualified veterinarian. There are two kinds of qualification. One is that you have some recognition or some licensing from some agency. It might be from the government. It might be from some organization that is providing certification of veterinarians. I would recommend that anyone who is practicing as a veterinarian would seek out and qualify with appropriate government agencies and with whatever certification agencies that are available, that you strive toward meeting those qualifications, taking the examinations and doing the other things that are suggested by different organizations to meet their standards of qualification. I think it is good for you, and I think it is a good thing for your customers. Also, I think it is very good to do continuing education. We study all the time. We study every day, constantly striving to improve ourselves. Another thing I would recommend is some sort of a mentoring program. A mentor could be somebody who's either alive or dead, and your mentor could be somebody that you call up on the phone, or it could be that you send a WeChat to, or it could be somebody that is no longer alive but has written a lot of things that may be useful for you. If you should like to contact us, we can do our best to try to help anyone who is wanting to improve themselves. Our question number 6 for today: how to quickly return to production when the blue ear disease, PRRS, fluctuates greatly. The first thing that I would suggest is that you do some survey testing. You find out where the virus is. Go into the nursery and test pigs, and go into the sow herd and test, get blood samples. I'd get 30 blood samples from the sow and 30 blood samples from the nursery. Get pigs of different ages in the nursery from weaning up until about 10, 12 weeks of age, and find out where the virus is and at what stage the animals are becoming infected. That will be very interesting to you and very useful in finding out what is going on, which I think is step number 1. The next thing that I would do is that I would make a killed autogenous vaccine, and I would vaccinate across the sows. There are laboratories that can do this work for you. It is highly effective. There's nothing that works quite so well as this. You can make a killed autogenous vaccine, vaccinate across the sows, pumien across the entire sow herd, and come back in 3 weeks and repeat it again in 3 months. And the piglets, I would vaccinate them at about 10 days of age, and then again at weaning. With any killed vaccine, you need 2 shots, 1 dose of vaccine in the sows. 1 dose of vaccine in the piglets is not going to do very much for you. There is no modified live vaccine that's going to do a very good job on the strains of PRRS that we have today. The PRRS virus is highly variable. It's very unlikely that any modified live virus vaccine is going to be very helpful for you. The use of killed vaccine has always been controversial. Dr. Federico Zuckerman at the University of Illinois had published one of the early papers stating that the use of killed vaccines was not particularly helpful. However, In recent years, Dr. Zuckerman has established a company of his own that is producing a killed vaccine. I wrote to Dr. Zuckerman. I asked him, Federico, why are you vaccinating now with the killed vaccine? Why are you telling people to use the killed vaccine whenever years ago you said that the killed vaccine was not useful? And his answer to me was, I was wrong. And so I consider Federico to be a real man. He's able to admit that he is wrong and change his mind about these things. There's some recent papers about modified live and killed PRRS vaccine. A little bit of time spent in the literature will reveal these papers to you. Over the years, we have never been satisfied with modified live vaccine, but we have had very good results with the killed vaccine. Killed autogenous vaccine will work very well if used as directed. How do pig farms do better to prevent the activity of biological vectors of disease? What measures and methods have been adopted? First of all, I would consider the issue of rodents. You need to get rid of their habitat, and you need to enact some baiting. So the first thing to do is to get rid of the vegetables and the trees in between the buildings. We love gardens. We like flowers. We like trees, but there's no place for those in between the big houses. Those just provide habitat for these undesirable creatures to live. We suggest that you put rock around the building to a depth of several centimeters. Put rock out for a distance of about 1.5 meters around the perimeter of each building, and then put the baits in boxes that the rodents like to go inside the boxes to hide. They find the bait in there, they feel like that they're stealing something from you, and they'll be very happy to consume the baits in this way. In regard to birds, we suggest that you use bird screening, bird netting, that you build the birds out of the building. In terms of mosquitoes and flies, just normal sanitation will do a decent job for you in taking care of the flies. We don't worry about the flies too much as being a powerful vector of disease. Still recommend all in, all out management. In regard to mosquitoes, for mature breeding boars, we strongly advise the use of air-conditioned, totally enclosed barns for boars. Japanese encephalitis is a problem almost everywhere in Asia, and the best way to get rid of JEV is to build it out of the buildings. If you have an air-conditioned, filtered boar barn, you're going to exclude the mosquitoes as well, and in doing so, you will exclude Japanese encephalitis. We still recommend that you vaccinate. However, we know from experience that the vaccination for JEV on boars is not particularly satisfying, and the best way to deal with this disease is simply to build the mosquitoes out by putting the boars inside a air-conditioned barn with commercial grade air conditioning, the kind of air conditioning that you find in shopping malls and in factories, not the kind of air conditioning that you have in your homes. Well, that concludes the questions that we have time for today, and I hope it was interesting for you and useful. Please continue to submit your questions, and we'll see you next week. Bye, y'all.